Uh, well, hello. So this is Nathan Smith and Seth Vitrano Wilson again, and with the light that
Hey.
shines in darkness. And This is the second episode of what we're planning to become a podcast. It's a YouTube series, just because we haven't figured out all the technical details and what's the best way to turn it into a podcast. But if you are just listening to it, then you're not missing much, because we're not doing anything exciting on the video side. So yeah. Um and Yeah, if you listen to the first one, you heard some of this. But uh I'm well, an economist, former professor. Long story about that. I'm a technology policy consultant, which has nothing to do with the topic of this podcast. I'm also a convert to Eastern Orthodoxy, and I've written a few things. I've written one article of apologetics in Touchstone magazine, and I've also written a book, and there's a long story about that I'm planning to come out and publish it soon. So I'll just it's called The Grand Coherence: A Modern Defense of Christianity. And if you're interested, I'll be releasing it probably as soon as I get around to posting it to all the different services and stuff, just for free. So that's partly where my thoughts come as I'm coming to this. And Seth, do you want to introduce yourself again in case people jump in the first time?
Yeah, sure. So I work in Bible translation and linguistics, and I live in Chiang Mai, Thailand. But I've known Nathan from long time in Colorado. We both grew up in the Mormon Church and found our different ways out of the Mormon Church and eventually into uh, at least in my case, a small O Orthodox Christianity. Um, and so that's an exciting story, both of our stories. But for now, we're going to have a conversation following up with what we did last time, kind of introducing apologetics. So
Yeah. And the title we had for this one is Christianity, Culture, and Philosophy. So, and I'll start by talking a little bit about culture. And I suppose even more fundamentally than that, why do you believe what you believe? The big general question you could ask to just about anybody. It's an important one. A lot of people think about it, but most people maybe don't think about it as much as might make sense to think about it. And often the answer is just, that's what my culture tells me to think. I think a lot of our beliefs you just kind of absorb by osmosis from the culture around us. Sometimes that includes Christian beliefs. Sometimes people just absorb Christian beliefs from the culture around them, and consider themselves Christian just because they're culturally Christian. That's how they were raised, and which is kind of not good enough. I think you do need to sort of think about it a little bit and really embrace it yourself, not just be conformist accepting it from the culture. But it is good to have that background. But and some people think of Christianity as just their culture. Of course, Christianity spans many different cultures. And I mean, Seth, you've seen more of this than many people, how Christianity can really reach beyond. It's not just a Western thing. It's all over the
yes,
world.
yeah. In fact, less and less of a Western thing. As Christian, the number of Christians in the West tends to decline, and the number of Christians in the global South, in Africa and Latin America and Asia continues to rise. So, but that said, yeah, there's many different cultural expressions of Christianity that are all faithful to what uh, to to who God is.
Yeah, and of course, um, uh, faithful to it, and maybe also not faithful to it. I mean, I think I know more about this um, from a Western perspective. I mean, if we look back on the history of the West and you say, well, is the West a Christian culture? Well, Christianity has had a very profound influence on Western culture for a very long time. But at the same time, like, has the West ever really been very conformable to Christian teachings and its conduct? Not very well. I mean, I think Christianity, there's a sense in which Christianity is always kind of a counterculture, even in the West, that's been Christian, sort of officially Christian for, probably 1500 years, maybe if you trace it from, say, 400 AD to 1900 AD or something like that, very, very long period in which it was Christianity was kind of the dominant faith. And yet, how conformable was Western conduct to the Gospels? Never really all that much. And I think this is always something where the really pursuit of, trying to live by the gospel teachings is something you have to break from your culture a little bit.
Certainly.
I think one problem with just believing whatever your culture tells you is that other people's cultures tell them different things. Not about everything. I mean, there's a lot of things on which most cultures agree, but there's also a lot of things where they really differ a lot. Where when a word like democracy, people would have very different responses to that, different times, different parts of the world, and I think in ancient Greece, then there was a lot of awareness of this. At a certain point, like 5th or 6th century AD, they encountered Persia, they'd encountered Egypt, and they realized how different their views were. And as there was this kind of intellectual awakening in Greece, then they realized, hey, we can't just take for granted that what we've been taught, that what our culture has taught us is true, because look, those Persians, those Egyptians believe something completely different. And this played a big role, I think, in the birth of philosophy in ancient Greece. And to some extent, I think that happened in Western Europe much later, as there's this kind of growth of thinking, kind of an intellectual awakening in the early modern period and in the Enlightenment. There's also kind of a birth of philosophy in a new way, where people say, hey, wait, this culture says this culture says that. What's really true? And so figures like Socrates and Descartes are kind of really digging in and trying to kind of explore that. And I mean, my impression is that this kind of philosophy, this Western philosophy, and this kind of critical thinking, which has become so important to kind of the Western mind, that it is kind of mostly characteristic of the West, more than other places in the world. But I'm curious, Seth, having lived abroad so much, do you have a similar impression, or is it?
I mean, the Enlightenment obviously was happened in the West, and had an impact on the West, maybe in different ways than in other places. But everybody thinks about things,
Mhm.
and everybody doesn't think about things, in the sense that
Yeah.
there's things that we all take for granted, and we just don't examine our assumptions.
Yeah.
And that's true of, it's true of everybody. It's true of Western Christians, Thai Buddhists, of European atheists. Anybody, has things that we just kind of assume and never even thought that anybody else might think differently. And that's one of the fun things about living cross-culturally, is you're like,
Yeah.
oh, I never thought to think of that, but
Yeah.
there it is staring at me, and okay, but yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I think everybody has the capacity for critical thinking. Some people do it a lot more than others, including obviously within cultures. And I think, a figure like Descartes, really, Descartes is famous for questioning everything, to the point where he said he made this project to systematically demolish all his own knowledge, and then he kind of tried to figure out, okay, is there anything that I really know is true, that I cannot doubt? And what he came up with was, I think, therefore I am, his famous epigram, meaning, so he was doubting even his own existence. But what he ended up saying, like, I can't doubt, is that I'm thinking, like, that's just too self-evident. I can't question that.
Yeah.
And if I'm thinking, I must exist, because it doesn't seem, I can't see how I could think without existing, so I must exist. So that it's kind of the measure of like how deep his doubts went. And then he kind of found his way back to believing in most kind of common sense things, because basically I think he thought, well, if I exist, there must be a source of my existence, and that must be God. And then he derived a bunch of conclusions about God, and then said, well, God wouldn't deceive. And so the rest of what I perceive with my senses must be true. Something like this. Then nobody really, I think, later philosophers have usually not been convinced by his answer. They've usually imitated like Descartes' like deep question, and then kind of sort of followed this skeptical course. But they've tried to anyway, intermittently tried to. And, it's in some ways, if you get too skeptical, you can't even like move through the day. Like, hey, how do I even know that like there's a floor and next to my bed that can hold my weight? And how do I even get out of bed? And I think, at some level, it's not really psychologically possible to doubt as much as many of the philosophers sort of officially do. But at least that motion and that sense that doubting everything is a good thing, it's a good virtuous thing to do, is kind of like haunts the West, both coming from Socrates in ancient times and then Descartes in modern times. And that's where my sense would be that that's a little bit distinctive of the West, of having that kind of tradition of sort of doubting everything.
At least on paper, at least officially.
Yeah.
The value, placing value on that kind of
yeah.
extreme skepticism, you might say.
Yeah.
I think I don't know of it elsewhere. I'm sure it happens, but
yeah. And I think with Christians, a lot of times they might see this as a threat, because of course, often what you're doubting is sometimes that will be Christianity. Sometimes people who kind of follow that path and kind of doubt everything end up doubting Christianity in particular. But so I think if you're educated in the West and you go through college, and then you'll often end up feeling like if you're educated in the West, then you will often get so much in the habit of criticizing everything and feeling like, hey, you could disagree, and everything's sort of up for grabs. If you make a claim, it can be contested. Certainly in science, I think this is characteristic. At one level, this is characteristic of science, where if you have a theory, you should be able to test it and run experiments. And if it doesn't successfully predict the results of the experiment, you're supposed to throw that theory out. So everything's sort of contestable. That's kind of the ethos of science, that it should always be like that. You go to church, suddenly it's not quite like that. You're expected to kind of conform to what the church teaches. And some people, I think, just are alienated by that. They just go into a church and they feel like they can't. Did you have that experience ever like just?
Oh, yeah. Growing up, I remember having genuine questions. I remember, for example, one of my questions as a Mormon kid, as a sincere thinking Mormon kid, was like, well, okay, so if God, the Mormon church teaches that humans, if we're good, we eventually become like God, and we have our own dominion, just like God has his dominion. And then Joseph Smith said that God was once a person, that he had a God. I mean, maybe that part is extrapolated, but I remember asking, well, if God had a God, and that God had a God, and that God had a God, well, why don't we worship the first God instead of our God? Like,
Yeah.
why don't we go back to the one who made everything? And kind of, he seems like the one that matters the most. And the answer was something along the lines of like, well, we just have to worship our God, and then there were other questions I would ask, and I felt like the answer so often was, well, you just have to have faith. And the reality was, at a certain point, that turned me off.
Yeah.
Because it felt like, well, anybody could tell me anything, and if I just they just keep on saying, well, you just have to have faith. Like, if you're in Scientology, or if you're in who knows, some kind of really crazy explanation of like, well, the reason this is that way is because there's some intelligent turtles that ate breakfast and they pooped out this thing, and that's why the universe is there, whatever. Like, well,
Yeah, you
I
could sort of
believe
say
that,
anything, and
right?
it's not sort of subject. Yeah, I mean, I have the same.
Yeah.
I think when I was growing up, then I was reading a lot, and then I was getting more and more, and sometimes I was trying to come up with arguments to defend Christianity or even Mormonism, against some of the kids at school, it would be sort of liberals or atheists or whatever, and I would look for arguments, and then I would find that maybe I'd find that those clashed with what I was taught at church, even if I was originally trying to defend the faith. But there was also just this question of, do I trust my own reason, or can my reason constantly be overridden by something that the church teaches that I didn't know about? And certainly the expectation was that, hey, your beliefs just conform to what the church tells you, and it clashed with intellectual honesty. And so ultimately I had to make this choice, like, am I going to let intellectual honesty sort of drive me where it will, which I think is the same thing that Descartes was wrestling with. Like, am I going to let intellectual honesty push me where it will lead? I mean, I think Descartes took a risk by doubting everything. He felt like he could come back and be sort of a faithful Catholic still at the end of that. But, a lot of other people probably would have doubted that he was still a faithful Catholic at the end of that. And certainly it led some others out of the church. And I mean, growing up Mormon, you have a strong sense of community. And I think this is something that a lot of people have. They feel like, hey, I'm part of this community. I value the community. I value the culture that I'm part of. But to be part of that culture, I have to believe, or at least pretend that I believe, a bunch of things that they traditionally claim, that it kind of like, that's the sort of part of the water that you swim in if you're part of this culture. And if I doubt that, then I risk sort of losing membership in the culture. So it can be a scary thing. But I think that is a step you need to take. I think you need to kind of trust your own reason. And right. I think C.S. Lewis is very interesting among. I mean, I'm a great admirer of C.S. Lewis, and I think C.S. Lewis is really key to why I'm a Christian today. But one thing about C.S. Lewis is he doesn't take things for granted. I mean, I think he does sort of stand ready to doubt everything and not just kind of like accept it from the culture. And so he does sort of follow that path of critical thinking, but still ultimately, if you join the church, if ultimately having doubted, having questioned and sort of studied for yourself, you do conclude that you accept Christianity, then you do need to, you end up participating in a different kind of conversation that doesn't feel like an academic seminar. You go to church and you talk to other Christians, and you all assume that you believe the same things. You accept a kind of an authority of it, and I can see why that would be off-putting to people who are really accustomed to critical thinking. They're like, how do you guys know this, that all this stuff is true? Why are we all acting like we know this stuff is true? Do we really have enough reason to believe it? And I think what people may miss is that inquiry is not an end in itself. Inquiry is a search for truth. And so you have to be willing to find the truth. And if you've found it, then you kind of stop inquiring. You can't still have all the same attitudes of an inquirer where everything is up in the air. You want to talk to people in a different way if you've kind of shared, this, if you've found this truth that you've shared. I
think, to kind of bring it back to the beginning, the idea of culture, we just, it's to simply live like just a blindly following, conforming to your culture. You could say it's almost guaranteed to lead you astray because there's always going to be things about culture that are wrong. And cultures are so variable, and they're so, contingent. They're so human, like created by human minds. So obviously created by human minds, coming together and deciding things. And it's there's just nothing really transcendent about any given culture that would inspire anyone to say like, oh, it must be like the capital T truth must be found in American culture or Chinese Chinese culture, or like whatever, like whatever you want to put on that. It's just like you're just saying it is ridiculous. You're like, yeah, really? Because it's so obvious to anybody who has traveled in different cultures that every culture has elements that are true and or helpful or stronger, and not so strong. Um, but I think,
Well, sins. I mean,
for
not
that,
to
yeah,
every culture has sins, and I think like in American culture,
exactly.
you go back and be like, hey, we traditionally really admire the founding fathers, and we sort of honor the Constitution as this like, you know, epitome of political wisdom. And hey, well, these guys all held slaves, and the
Yeah.
Constitution upheld
It has
slavery,
its
and it's like,
limitations.
and also very poor treatment of dispossession of a lot of Native Americans who so there's lots of injustice that's kind of like really
Right.
woven into the fabric of American life from the beginning. And that's true of every culture
Exactly.
in the world.
Yes. Yeah. Right, exactly. So I think there has to be an element of deconstruction. Like you have to, and I do believe that's true of both of people who grow up in, Christian households and of people who grow up in all kinds of other different households. And I think I've seen it too often that people are not curious enough. They're not willing to really think and as you said, seek truth, like and actually to embrace truth as a beautiful goal. Like, there's and I think that's for me, there's I when I was encountering as an atheist, or at least as a, agnostic that leaned atheist, I encountered Christian friends that they just had such a different attitude and approach to truth than I encountered in say in Mormon Sunday school kind of
Mm-hmm.
uh, classes, where I was never told. I don't remember a single, Christian friend of mine in college ever telling me, well, you just have to have faith. And I'm sure there are Christians that would say that. But these, the people that I talked to about these things, they just never thought that way. They had a sense of
Yeah.
confidence that like the truth is good and you seek it, you'll get to a good place,
Yeah.
and don't be afraid of it. Don't be afraid. And it reminds me of, what Jesus said, ask and you'll be given, seek and you will find, knock and the
Mm-hmm.
door will be open to you. There's that kind of like the openness to thinking, the openness to inquiry, that is, I think, extremely healthy for Christians actually to have.
Yeah.
Say like, I wonder what's going on here, and I've personally seen so many times where kind of what you might call a closed-minded, just like, no, 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 we gotta just, justify this thing that we think is Christianity. I've actually seen it backfire so often where it's like, no, that's not Christianity. You're
Yeah.
defending something that you think you have to defend, and that's not what the Bible says at all, or that's not like
Yeah.
whatever it might be. Like that's your culture. Why you don't need to defend that? That's your culture. That's not
Yeah.
God. So obviously, I
Yeah.
think there's times where humans can deconstruct too far, um, and be too skeptical. But I think that starting from that assumption of like seeking truth it's gonna lead you to a good place. I think is
Yeah.
extremely healthy
Yeah.
and
You need a
necessary.
way out of skepticism because if you take um, start from Descartes and then follow through a few generations of philosophers, and you get to Thomas Hume. And no,
Yeah.
what am I talking about? David Hume. And he doubts everything. He doubts causation. For example, it's like, okay, well, wait a minute. Where does this causation thing come from? Why do we believe in that? Let's see. So we see one thing happening and then another thing happening, but where's this causation thing that connects the two? I don't get it. Then his attack on induction, or his critique of induction. So,
Yeah.
if the sun rose 10,000 times, does that prove that it's going to rise tomorrow?
Well,
No, not
technically
logically.
no.
It could rise 10,000 times and then not the next day. And if we say, well, it seems like we extrapolate from patterns, it tends to predict, then you're just extrapolating from patterns to justify extrapolating from patterns. It's circular. So, so I think, skepticism, ordinary people don't really think about it, but philosophers do. Philosophers understand sort of how difficult it is to justify any knowledge at all, to rebut sort of skepticism. And I think, there is a way to answer that. And I think it does depend on, you mentioned the word faith.
Mhm.
At some level, I think you do have to have you have to have a faith of sorts. So even with the sun rising tomorrow, if you take Hume's example, like his, well, how do we know the sun will rise tomorrow? It's true that the fact that it rose 10,000 times doesn't logically imply that it has to rise tomorrow. But somehow this world does seem to be orderly and patterned, and it does seem to have this sort of overarching design. And so, and it seems that we can perceive it. We can understand, we can glimpse it, grasp it a little bit, using our ideas and our intuitions. And so now that takes a little bit of faith.
Yeah.
If you really drill down, you're like, you have to have a little bit of faith that the patterns in the world are going to continue. And that I think is a more appropriate use of faith. I mean, there's a lot of different ways that idea of faith can be used, and actually maybe bringing in a more of a relational or an interpersonal idea might shed even more light on it. But I think using faith as an excuse for believing things or insisting that other people believe things that can't be rationally defended, I think that's an abuse of the concept of faith. And it's certainly come up quite a bit. I mean, I think it's been fairly common and since the Enlightenment, when Christians couldn't figure out how to win the argument, then a lot of times they just fell back on, well, you have to believe it by faith. Sometimes this is called fideism, and this kind of like sharp distinction between faith and reason. And so that has happened a number of times, and I think that's kind of a perennial error.
Right.
And the way the Bible's quoted is an interesting case in point, because Christians do generally, I mean, I think this is a pretty strong generalization, that if you have a conversation between Christians and they quote the Bible, they don't quote the Bible in order to criticize
it. Yeah.
They treat it as authoritative. I'm not sure how illuminating that is. Let's say they quote the Bible in order to agree with it, in order to emulate it or to reinforce a point. And sometimes I think people will look at this, people who are a little bit more intellectually inclined or trying to defend the faith will look at this practice, and then they'll say, well, that's because the Bible is inerrant. That's because the Bible is this sort of perfect document. And like, well, that doesn't quite work. Did you ever read the book of Job? Where, Job's friends come to him and they give these long speeches that sound pretty pious, and you could easily quote them at length and they would sound like totally all about the justice of God, and how, basically, if you don't know the story of the book of Job, then God and Satan are having some kind of a conversation, and God mentions his servant Job as an example of how someone who's very, very faithful. And Satan says, well, that's just because he has things so well. He's really rich, and he's just been really fortunate, so naturally he'll help you. But if you take away all his possessions, then he'll curse you. And so God accepts the challenge and takes away all his possessions. All these disasters are afflicted. All his flocks are destroyed, and his children die in a catastrophe. Suddenly everything's taken away. But Job doesn't curse God, and then so God says, hey, see this? And Satan says, well, he's still got his help. That's the main thing. And so if you take that away, he'll curse you, says Satan. So God then goes back and takes away Job's health, and he's afflicted with these boils, and he's kind of sitting in the dirt, totally. But he still doesn't curse God. But so then 3 of Job's friends come to comfort him. And initially they sit there just for 7 days. They're just so stricken with grief at the misfortunes that have befallen their friend Job. But afterwards, then they start giving him some words of advice. And then so there's this long conversation. Most of the book of Job is this long conversation in which Job is lamenting the day, cursing the day he was born, and just really miserable and kind of seeming kind of bitter. And then his friends keep coming back. And in one way or another, they say, look, well, you must have done something wrong. That's why God's punishing you. And they have really elaborate praises of God and stuff. But at the end of the book, God speaks out of the whirlwind and he rebukes Job's friends because they weren't. He says, you didn't speak truly of me. My servant Job was the one who was speaking. Yeah. And so, when it's a wonderful book. It's very, very full of wisdom. But one of the takeaways of this is that the Bible isn't inerrant in any simple sense. It's not inerrant like a multiplication table or a train schedule. It's a much wiser, much richer, much more complex book than that. And there's all sorts of things that you could quote from the Bible that would be totally wrong and if there's a sense in which the larger context would tell you that it's wrong, but you wouldn't know that just by quoting it. And Christians don't ordinarily. When they quote the Bible, it's not that they quote it only in very, very long passages so that you can see the whole context and how everything connects to each other. They'll quote little verses and stuff. And it's certainly not the case that by quoting the Bible that way, you will infallibly be saying something that's true.
Sure.
So that's a misunderstanding of the nature of the Bible. But at the same time, it is right. I think it's a good practice for Christians to quote the Bible only to agree with it. Because that helps to build up the Christian community. I mean, there's this very large truth that Christians agree in, and they're constantly trying to apply to more fully understand, to educate each other about it, to encourage each other about it. And quoting the Bible is part of the way that Christians do that with each other. And so I think that particularly that idea of biblical inerrancy is a stumbling block for some people. And once you understand it in that kind of larger way, I think that can become less of a stumbling block. It's not that you have to pick up the Bible and agree with every single, thing that's said in it. There's a lot more to understand about it, about how it all fits together. And some of it you might not be able to understand right away. That's okay. Leave it alone.
Exactly. And that's, I think, even you could say a more conservative stance on biblical inerrancy, such as the Chicago Statement, it says that the Bible is inerrant in all that it affirms. Meaning, you have to think, well, what is God saying about this? God, there's a story. There's some story about some people being evil to each other. And you're like, well, what is God saying about this? He's not saying it's good,
Yeah.
And the author sometimes says, oh, this is bad. Sometimes it just tells the story.
Yeah.
You can't just look at a Bible story and think, oh, God is approving of this. In fact, very often he's not at all, So, but anyway, I think that's worth saying and worth helping people understand. I think in terms of that kind of, we were talking about the deconstruction. I like what you said about everybody has to have an element of faith, and that was something that I had to kind of come to and understand, because it wasn't, you could say it wasn't the dominant idea in Western culture. And in Western culture, the dominant idea is, well, you have faith and you have reason, and they're going against each other. You have faith and science or these kinds of things. And that was how I thought. And then, to realize that no, actually, I have faith in things as an atheist, as a scientist, whatever. And I think, frankly, science, I mean, you see it all the time. It's a very social thing. If you have ideas that are just a little outside the mainstream in science, you could get labeled as a heretic, you could lose your job. And there's all kinds of scientists that just say what they say in order to keep their tenure, in order to, whatever it is. And so scientific revolutions often, I think they don't take place until the holders of the old theory die. It was literally I forget who it was that said that, but so I think
that was
scientists are humans, right? And so you have to, people do have faith. Scientists have faith in certain ideas. Maybe those are good ideas, maybe those are bad ideas. But as a practical matter, you have to live your life having faith in things. You have to assume certain things. You can't, if you live with just this extreme skepticism, you're not going to get anywhere in life. And I think that's another thing that kind of, for me, I remember once having a conversation with a Belgian roommate of mine when I was living in Lebanon. who asked me about this, like this question about believing and accepting things on faith and things like that. And we talked about a lot of things, but one of the things I said was, uh, before you get married, I wasn't married at this point yet, but I still understood what marriage was. Um, Before you get married, you're gonna ask a lot of questions about if you're meeting, if I'm meeting somebody and I meet some nice lady and I think about, well, would we go well? Is this person somebody that I would really enjoy? Somebody that matches, who shares my values and shares my interests and whatever it might be. And there's a lot of questions, and there's going to be a lot of people that you're not even going to go very far down that road of inquiry. You're going to say, thanks, and others that you might think about a little more. But ultimately, there's a point where you're going to say, all right, I'm choosing to commit myself to this person. And when you have done that, then there's a relational aspect uh, to the way that you interact with that person. And I said to my friend, I said, look, I I love Jesus. I've given my life to Jesus. I didn't do that blindly. I did that after having gone through a whole inquiry phase, and but ultimately when I've fallen in love, and I've made that commitment, and with my mind and with my heart, I'm committed. And so, that doesn't mean that you don't think through things, beyond that. But there's a kind of, in marriage, there's a kind of skepticism that's not healthy to the relationship. If you're constantly doubting your wife's fidelity to you, I mean, man, that's gonna not go well. It's not gonna lead to a
Mhm.
healthy relationship. And I think in a similar way, like, when you've committed to Jesus, you don't do that unthinkingly. But when you've done that, then to doubt God's goodness, to doubt his, to kind of character, that's not going to help. And I
Yeah.
think that is a helpful metaphor. It's also strongly, in the Bible, it shows up a lot. You have talking about we, the church is the bride of Christ, and the wedding feast is a picture of the great, when Jesus comes back and makes all things right, all things new, and evil is put away. Then it's a wedding feast. And that's, even the Song of Solomon, the book of the Bible, that is extremely uh what shall we call it? Very fun,
Yeah.
erotic,
Yeah, exactly.
book. And it's very, very often looked to as a metaphor of the relationship between God and his people. So it's very exciting. That relationship with
Yeah.
God it's very exciting. It's not dry and just dull and you just got to have faith. No, it's a very beautiful, wonderful, exciting, romantic thing in a sense to have that relationship with God. I think, people humans are made for that. We're made for that kind of deep belonging in God.
Yeah. And
And
then
so,
but it brings out
yeah,
faith too. The concept of faith, I think I mentioned it in connection with, like, will the sun rise tomorrow? Does that require an element of faith? That's more in sort of a more intellectual sense. But there's also, you can talk about a faithful friend.
yeah,
And that means somebody who will stick up for you. You can rely on them to come through, and they won't just be like, yeah, I don't really care about him anymore. So and and I think having faith in a relationship, um, partly this means you kind of leave some possibilities out of account. So
yeah,
if you have, let's suppose that you have a friend who's visiting, and um you have a bunch of cash in in your house somewhere. And so, before your friend shows up, then you carefully go in and lock the cabinet where the cash is, and like put the key in your pocket. Like, well, I mean, I don't think he'd steal from me, but it's pretty easy to lock the cabinet. Why not just go ahead and do that? I think even jump something like that, that would really suggest, like, hey, is this a real friendship? Because you know probably you don't even think about that. If you've got a strong friendship with someone, and so I think that's part of it with I think in the case of God too, it's having faith in God. It's partly like, you kind of leave out of account that God will let you down. and among within Christian communities too. I think some things just sort of start being kind of taken off the table, and that's how
Yeah.
you build up a community.
And I think it's put off the table because you know him. You're like,
Mhm.
he wouldn't do that. In the same way
Yeah,
that if you really know a good friend or your spouse, like I just know, like they're not going to do that. And
yeah,
I mean, some humans might do that. Some spouses or friends
mhm.
might betray you and let you down. But one of the really strong themes of Scripture is that though let God be true and every man a liar. Like that, yeah. Even if humans do let you down, that just shows how much better God is than humans, right? Like
Yeah.
the story of the Bible is remarkable in how over and over again it's just a story of human failure, and not in a unsympathetic way. I think
Mhm.
it's the Bible is very sympathetic toward human weakness. It takes it seriously because of the terrible, destructive effects of human weakness and sin. But it's as anybody who's studied history knows, the effects of sin can be pretty drastic. But it's if you compare it to uh, uh, some other scriptures. I mean, for example, I know living in the Middle East, uh, I struck how when a Muslim would find out stories in the Bible about their heroes, whether it's David or Jesus, well, not Jesus,
Mhm.
David or Moses or anybody else, except for Jesus. In the Bible, you see the Bible is just full of their mistakes,
Yeah,
especially somebody like David, let's say,
yeah,
it's unblushingly, just almost unrelentingly honest and open and
mhm.
candid about like, yeah, they were great in this area, and then they really messed up.
Yeah,
And boy, God was not happy about that. And I
yeah,
think, for somebody who's grown up believing that the prophets have to be sinless, that's a shocking thing to see. Like, how can you say that David, committed adultery? How can you say that?
yeah, yeah.
It's
Or
because he said
Elijah
it,
too. I
and
think
because
Elijah. I mean, Elijah probably does better than David, I guess, overall. But it's interesting how Elijah goes in and after his dramatic
yeah,
demonstration and he slaughters all the priests of Baal. The Bible doesn't say he was right to do that. Um, but I mean, they might be somewhat justified because I think they were like sacrificing children to their Moloch all the time, and so like okay, maybe they deserved it. But immediately after that, he's driven into the wilderness. He hears that Jezebel is after him. He's driven into the wilderness, and then he begs God to take his life because he says, "I'm no better than my father." Like he immediately has this like dark night of the soul. His faith just seems to totally collapse after one of the most
mm.
dramatic demonstrations of faith in the whole. I mean, the fact that he built it up that way, and he's had so much confidence in God to come through for him, and then so even somebody like Elijah, his faith seems to just collapse. John the Baptist,
Yeah,
he gets thrown in prison, and then he sends. I mean, he was the one who, before Jesus had been announced, he says, he's
it
coming.
was him.
Messiah's coming.
Yeah,
I'm not even fit to untie his shoelaces and or undo the strap of his sandals. I mean, he really saw Jesus coming and proclaimed him. And then he gets thrown in prison and he sends some disciples to say, "Hey, Jesus, are you the one who was going to come, or shall we wait for another?" It seems like
yeah,
his faith faltered too. Obviously, Peter, betrays him three times, the night before. James and John are totally off base a few times. They're like asking, "Hey, should we call down fire from heaven on this village that didn't believe me?" Says, "No, don't do that." No. Um, and and so the Bible really goes out of its way, I think, to point out the
yeah, yeah,
flaws of all of the people who
yes,
really stand out as being heroes.
yeah. In
And
both the Old and New Testaments, just throughout. Yeah,
yeah, I mean,
yeah,
I guess even with Jesus, the fact that it highlights that he prayed in the Garden of Gethsemane for the cup to be taken from him. But I mean, I think you wouldn't say that's a sin because that's just human nature, you know, um, being expressing a desire that is natural to human nature, but then submitting to the will of God when that wasn't what God wanted. But it's still just mind-boggling, I think, to think about.
yeah.
Jesus praying that in the Garden of Gethsemane, but or crying out from the cross, God, oh God, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? But aside from individuals, though, it also applies to the culture of the Jews, because the Jews are called, chosen by God. They're rescued from Egypt. They're given this specific law, and I think they really stand out from other peoples. I mean, in terms of the, I mean, obviously not sacrificing their children to Moloch and stuff like that, or worshiping gods that are made by supposed gods that are made by human hands and that are obviously just statues. And so, I mean, in those ways they stand out. But also, I mean, I think that, the law with the forgiveness of debts, and there is still slavery, but there's a release of slavery after a few years. I mean, it's much more merciful than human codes that had come before that. But the Jews then end up taking a lot of pride. Not all the Jews, I should never generalize. I mean, Peter and the apostles are Jews too, but at least the Jewish leadership and stuff, and in a large part of the Jewish nation, a lot of the Jews end up pride in being chosen people, and then not realizing that they were meant to be a blessing to all of mankind, but instead being, starting to be very exclusive. So there's also, a failure on their part. And I think this applies to all the cultures that we're part of. I mean, I mentioned with America, I think there's a lot to be proud of in America and its history. I think it's done a lot of good in the world. I think it's good that it defeated the Nazis and stuff, but, it also, there was slavery, there was dispossession of the Native Americans. There were also CIA-backed coups in Guatemala and Iran, and then later in Vietnam. And there was, there's also a lot in U.S. history, I think, to be ashamed of. And there's probably a lot that I can't see to be ashamed of, because I'm still part of this culture, and I'm a little bit blinded by its propaganda in ways that, might be obvious 100 years from now. And I think, so that experience of questioning one's culture and can leave you with a very orphaned feeling, because I think if you pursue that for a little while, wait a minute, it felt good to have this sense of faith, of not doubting the rightness of, what is it that you don't doubt? I think for some people in history, it's they don't doubt their nation. They don't doubt that Germany is in the right, France is in the right, or whatever. And it gives you this sense of community, this sense of there's a comfort in that, but it's always an illusion, because all of these cultures have lots of sins and lots of faults. And if you start sort of looking that truth in the face, then the distance that it creates and the position it forces you into, where you're in a bit of a counterculture, and you sort of have a critical stance with respect to your culture, that can be a very lonely place to be. And so I think in the Christian church, sort of rightly understood, and there's a lot that's sort of hidden in that statement, because that doesn't mean the official hierarchy has a lot of good people in it at many times, but it's not, that's not, I think, where the church resides. I mean, we mentioned on the last episode, I think, that the Gospels don't even mention bishops at all. It's this community of the faithful, those who have united themselves to Christ, and those who are really striving to, in as much as what they're doing is in the service of Christ and in the Gospels, in as much as they're part of the body of Christ, there's a community that isn't founded on sin. And so I think you can think for yourself as best you can. And there's a bunch of worldviews out there that kind of come prepackaged, sort of, more or less, scientific materialism, Buddhism, Islam, and so forth. And so you can try to kind of accept all those, but of course they differ among themselves, and how do you know which one is actually true? That can lead you into philosophy, where you just try to sort of think for yourself, and that can be a wonderful enterprise to undertake, but it's pretty hard to do that. I think we're very reliant on other people for what we know, And um, and yet, if we rely on other people for to know things, that means becoming integrated into some sort of a culture. And but all the cultures are vitiated. All the cultures are flawed. All the cultures have kind of sins sort of woven into them. Um, and but this is where Jesus has come in, because Jesus has come in with teachings that transcend all that, that rise above that. And I think a lot of people, I mean, even people who aren't Christians, I think a lot of times just recognize, hey, there's something, there's something different
Yeah.
about it. Like,
And I
nobody's
think
perfect,
a
we
lot
say,
of
except for Jesus. Nobody really seems to find fault with him. And so there's something, and so it's kind of a refuge, I think. I mean, I think it's an escape from all the kind of fallen cultures of mankind.
yeah.
It's something to pursue.
And I think a lot of Christians and myself included end up approaching it from that angle where we say like where we have an encounter with who Jesus is. And
Mhm.
when I say encounter, I mean both reading the Gospels, reading what his early followers said about him and taught about him. But then also, encounter where you see in your life and in your prayers and in all these things, you see who God is and God meets you there spiritually. And I think those things that really can are an entry point for many, many people. And I think a lot of people end up looking at who Jesus is and saying, oh, he's awesome. And okay, if he is who he says he is in the
Mhm.
Gospels, then that's and it's difficult to construct a Jesus that doesn't claim those things, because the claims of Jesus that are extraordinary, especially in his Jewish highly monotheistic culture, the claims he's making about himself are so like high, in throughout every single gospel, Matthew, Mark, the earliest gospels that are claimed, and the earliest Christian creeds out of some of the epistles that are claimed. It's very high position that Jesus is claiming for himself and that his followers are claiming for him. And that, it's even, liberal or atheist scholars acknowledge that there's a lot of what Jesus said about himself that is, you could say, abnormally high status, for
Yeah.
somebody who would, he wasn't like Buddha. And I think that's something that it's interesting when you study Buddhism, for example. The Buddha specifically told people, don't worship me. I'm just a guy, I'm just a teacher. There was a real sense in which like he had this sense of like, oh, I'm just a human, because he
Yeah.
was just a human, right?
Yeah.
And Jesus, he just doesn't have that approach. People were astonished by like his authority. He's like, he spoke as one who has
Yeah.
authority, and not like the scholars, the Bible scholars, and the
Yeah.
people, the Jewish teachers of the law of Moses and stuff, who always would quote somebody else and quote their authorities. And Jesus just comes in and says, "For it said," quoting from the scriptures, and he said, "But I say to you."
Yeah.
It's like that. Yeah, God said this to you before, but I'm telling you now.
Yeah.
Wow, he's got chutzpah,
Yeah.
right? But and yet he's got that chutzpah, that kind of claim, the high claims, but he's got such an amazing life and such amazing teaching, and so many people have seen that character and said, well, he can't be I don't think he's lying. I don't think
Hmm.
he's crazy. I think he really means what he says, and he is who he says he was. And
Yeah.
when you come to that, then you look at, well, what was Jesus's relationship to the scriptures? What was Jesus's relationship to the story of Israel, and all of these things? And so a lot of people end up coming to, trust in the Bible's authority because of what Jesus's relationship to his scriptures, to the Jewish
Yeah.
scriptures, and so I think those are things that a lot of some people maybe come to faith where they already have faith in the Jewish scriptures, and then they say, oh well, these point to Jesus, and that's certainly how a lot of his contemporaries how that happened for them. Uh,
Yeah.
but then for someone like me, as a Gentile coming into it, I see Jesus, and then I come to faith in the Bible through Jesus.
Yeah.
But whatever that route is, I think uh, it is, as we said, it's a you start with that inquiry, in questioning, and say, okay, what have I been taught, and what's really true? But at a certain point, um, you got to find what actually is true, and when you find that, you commit to it and you live it out, and and it's a great life to walk through. So that's my experience.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I think I to say I think therefore I am, and then to try to derive all knowledge from that doesn't really work. There's not enough there to build
Yeah.
a kind of a general foundation of knowledge on. And I think um an encounter with Jesus, both in the scriptures and personally, I think, and through thinking about it and applying it, and that can give you a kind of certitude where you've come in touch with something that's true, and as you doubt other things, which I think it's important to do. I mean, I think you realize how different the cultures are. There's a lot of things you should doubt just because you others have got it wrong. Maybe we're getting it wrong, and then also when you encounter the amount of sin that is in the background of injustice and wickedness and cruelty that is interwoven in all of human cultures, I think that also is a strong reason to try to separate yourself out from that. But what are you left with? And I think if you're left with nothing, if you don't have Jesus to kind of fall back on, I think it's hard to follow through with that, because you end up being so isolated. But I think it's in when you start to get to know Jesus, there's so much to discover there, and so much to strive for, to try to kind of practice in your life. And then the next step is you do want to find a community. I mean, Jesus has a relationship not just with you, but with many other people, and he wants the people who are trying to follow Jesus to get to know each other, and to love each other, and to learn from each other. And so that's the next step. But I think you don't want to start with, well, there's a sense in which you don't want to start with the church. I mean, of course, probably you will, in most cases, you'll get to know Jesus through the church, but just the culture, just a Christian culture, just an institutional church, that's not enough. That's not the right starting place. I think, I mean, the Christian church has an amazing record of lasting for centuries and millennia, and outlasting nations and schools of thought, and languages and peoples and polities and empires and so forth. And they've all been swept away, and the church is still here and spreading. And how is it able to do that when all other human institutions seem to kind of corrupt and fizzle away and are much more transient than that? And that's really because people's relationship with Jesus is the first thing. That's the kind of constant source of renewal in the church down the centuries. And sometimes I think they'll be part of a culture, and then they'll see the culture around them changing, and it'll be very discombobulating, because there were things that they thought were permanent, and now they're just kind of going out of fashion. And at some stage in life, people are like, well, what are my grandkids even going to know? They're going to be so different from me, and everything that I'm accustomed to is getting kind of repudiated, and people respond to it in different ways. They can be depressed, or sometimes they get defensive, and start to really try to lock in what they know. But if you've committed your life to the church, and if that's the community that you sort of find your identity in, and when you start to sort of understand the great adventure of the church down the ages, and the power that lies at the heart of the church, then that fear, I think, can really be dispelled, because the church it is a culture, and it's not a culture. It's kind of a culture, but it's really transcends all the other cultures that we know about. And so yeah, I mean, I think, just to like summarize takeaways. So Christianity shouldn't just be cultural thing. You should, if you've been raised and you're kind of like a cultural Christian, then that might be good up to a point, but it's not enough. And you need to maybe engage in some philosophical questioning. Certainly you need to arrive at your own conviction of it, that doesn't have to come from the intellect. I mean, I think it should also come from, an effort to live by Christian ethics, which is, even harder and more important. It's not as much the theme maybe of this podcast, but and often, you'll need to doubt your culture, and kind of find a new culture within the faith and within the truth of Christian teaching. So, well, I mean, that's my attempt to sum up, I guess, but you should probably wind down. This is fun. It's fun. It's so many, it touches everything, I think.
Sure does. And there's
um,
probably, 30 or 40 books in both of our minds that we've read that are contributing to these conversations. So maybe we could put some of them in the links below or whatever. There's some excellent works that have been written thinking about these very things.
That's a good point. We
Yeah.
should do that. I'll probably post this to YouTube, to today, and then we could jump in and add some reading recommendations. And yeah. So anyway, well, I'll see you later, Seth. You'll probably be in Thailand when I talk to you again, I guess.
Quite possibly. Yeah. Look forward to it.
All right. Have a good night.